So today we have the honor to have Shaun Gallagher. He's the Lillian and Murray Moss Professor of Excellence in Philosophy at the University of Memphis, Professorial Fellow at the School of Liberal Arts in the University of Melbourne in Australia. He has the Humboldt Foundation Annelies Mayer Research Fellow, and he has held the honorary professorship at Tromsø University in Norway, in Durham, the UK, in Copenhagen, in Denmark, and he has had visiting positions in Cambridge, Lyon, Paris, Berlin, Oxford, and Rome. His areas of research include phenomenology, philosophy of mind, embodied cognition, social interaction, concepts of self, and hermeneutics. His publications include Action and Interaction in 2020, Performance and Art in the Venetian Lectures in 2021, The Phenomenological Mind, and Activist Interventions, which we read last year, Rethinking the Mind, and many others. And he's also the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Phenomenology and the Cognitive Science, a very well-known journal. So it's an honor for us to have you here, Shaun. And whenever you want to start, you can. Okay.
Well, I think I probably should start now then. First of all, thank you to you all for having me here or there, and I'm looking forward to our discussion. So I'm going to share my screen. And we should be able to see that at this point. I want to get rid of this. That. Yeah, I'm going to hide this. Okay. So the title is Enactive Solutions to the Integration Problem in Psychiatry. And here's an outline. I hope I'll be able to get through all of this. I'll start by trying to give you a sense of what the integration problem is in the context of psychiatry. I'll then try to give you a sense of how I'm thinking of integration, and I'll refer to it as a kind of enactive integration. And then I'll try to outline a threefold method for exploring the dynamics of integration. And in the end, if we have time, I'll talk about Autism Spectrum Disorder as a test case for this. So the integration problem in psychiatry, the various accounts of how one can integrate a number of different factors in the context of discussing psychiatric disorders can be narrow or wide, using those in a kind of technical sense where people use them in the philosophy of mind. So in terms of a narrow concept, I think Philip Gerrans gives us a good account. So this is in his book, The Measure of Madness. And in the context of explaining delusion, he proposes an interdisciplinary integration to explain how the mind configures itself in response to incoming information. He proposes, I think, what is a relatively standard two-factor account of delusions. And here, the classic work is work by Andy Young, his explanation of Capgras as delusion in terms of something going wrong in the neural processes, generating an anomalous experience, and then the delusional aspect is the attempt to explain, the patient's attempt to explain that in a kind of confabulatory way. So generally speaking, the delusion looks something like this, some subpersonal mechanism. In the case of Gerrans, he suggests it's the default mode brain area that malfunctions in some way, generates here a pre-reflective anomalous experience, and then we get a kind of reflective or narrative confabulation where there's an attempt to explain this in terms of false beliefs and so forth. And of course, to address these different levels of analysis, we need different types of sciences. Neuroscience will tell us about what's going wrong in the brain. Phenomenology will try to give us a characterization of the pre-reflective anomalous experience. And then some kind of cognitive or narrative analysis will tell us how this reflective confabulation works. And these are the particular disciplines that Gerens names. He treats the entire cognitive system as an information processing one, invoking hierarchical arrangements of top-down predictive processing, which of course requires reference states for comparison between higher and lower levels. And he combines this with mainly a bottom-up neural network theory. And then he also pursues an explanatory strategy in terms of causal relevance, appealing to new mechanist models, Carl Craver's ideas, and Jim Woodward's interventionist view of causality. So it's a pretty complex set of things that he's juggling here in terms of his attempt to give an explanation of how lots of different things combine and integrate to cause these delusions. One challenge for his integrative account is precisely how to integrate these different models, all of which depend on the concept of levels. And what I think we get from Gerens in the end is something like a mishmash of different levels. So to be clear, the issue here is not just about integrating cognitive narrative plus personal, experiential, and then the subpersonal neurological levels, but also integrating the various theories and models, all of which seemingly talk about different levels. And he's appealing to narrative analysis, phenomenology, neuroscience, predictive processing, mechanist theory. And it turns out, as he himself notes here, that it's a difficult job. So he says, the notion of levels is ubiquitous, but not everyone uses it in the same way. It can refer to ordering relationships between theories. It can refer to the objects of theories ordered by size or complexity. So for example, cells are smaller and less complex than the organs they make up. It can refer to functional analyses. For example, vision is a higher level property than edge detection. Or it could refer to levels of mereological containment. For example, parts are at a lower level than wholes. These uses can overlap, so it gets very complex. And he says the notion of level relevant to his own analysis is that of mechanism. Higher levels correspond to the organization of components, lower levels to the components themselves. One issue here, however, is that that mechanism model may not be sufficient for the kind of predictive processing account he wants to get out of this, which requires reference state comparators between higher and lower levels. I'm not sure myself how mechanist theories handle those kind of comparator type levels, but it's not at all clear in that type of account how that will work. I want to mention, however, there are wider types of approaches to the whole integration issue. And here Louis Sass, drawing on both phenomenological psychiatry and George Engel's biopsychosocial model, proposes what Sass calls a biophenosocial integrative account, where bio signifies genetics and neuronal processes and so forth. And then, of course, phenomenology should be able to clarify the experience of the psychopathic subject, and then also social factors have to be taken into account. So these are all different types of factors, a kind of heterogeneous collection of different things that need to be integrated in some fashion. And he, I think, rightly worries about how to explain the relations among the various component processes. Are they hierarchical? Should we think of them as causal, or should we think of them as constitutive, and so forth? So, for example, one question has to do with the place of the social and the cultural and how that gets integrated into some of the other types of factors. If we think, especially in terms of the similar kind of hierarchy that Gerens was talking about, we might think that the social and cultural is really a sort of top-down type of issue, and someone like Kitayama would suggest that, where Kitayama and colleagues conceive of culture as a kind of package of propositional constructs. So, for example, values, beliefs, worldviews, these are kind of higher order, top-down type things that will affect our experience. So we could put the social and cultural at the top, but it might be possible to see that the social and cultural have some kind of effect on our pre-reflective awareness. And as you might know, there's something of a debate about this ongoing in phenomenological contexts, where someone like Dan Zahavi basically wants to reject the idea that the social cultural can somehow or other be in any way intrinsically involved in pre-reflective, the pre-reflective minimal self, for example. But then there are a number of other philosophers who argue that, well, yes, the social and cultural does certainly impinge upon our experiential processes. So Matthew Radcliffe, Marian Costello, Anna Shanaka, and Katerina Foutopoulou all argue with Zahavi on this point. So that's an unsettled type of issue. Or we might think of the social cultural as impacting subpersonal mechanisms, even to the level of genes and neurons. Here I would reference a really very interesting and brilliant, I think, experiment by Glenberg and Solomon, who show that social cultural factors do impact on the most basic neuronal processes, especially those processes connected with sensory motor aspects of our experience, body schematic processes, and so forth. They would say that the social cultural can very well have a role to play at that very basic level. Sass, I think, with his analysis entangled in the theoretical framework of levels, remains pessimistic. He says these questions pertain to theoretical issues that are difficult or even impossible to settle, such as overall attitudes towards holistic explanation, or the enigmatic mind-body problem, generally viewed as utterly insolvable. So he is still puzzling about how to fit all these levels together, so to speak, or to integrate them. I think in this context, Seneca de Haan does some really excellent work, and she offers what I take to be an alternative, wide, enactive model of integration in her recent book, Enactive Psychiatry. And not unlike the biopheno-social model of SAS, she includes phenomenological, social, and neurobiological components. And I think importantly, she adds the existential dimension, which is for her the idea that the person is reflectively aware of her own situation and can take an evaluative attitude towards it. So there's a kind of reflective existential aspect involved here. The integration problem she addresses very clearly and proposes a view of integration based on what she defines as organizational causality. And she argues that discussions of reciprocal causality or circular causality found in some enactivist authors, such as, well, Francisco Varela, but also Thomas Fuchs, do not go far enough. So if there are problems with something like reciprocal causality or even maybe circular causality, it may be that perhaps they still reference levels. And once you start talking about levels, there's always temptations of reductionism, even if you don't go that way. And also, the focus on the analysis tends to be more dyadic rather than holistic. So I mean, I think she suggests there are reasons to move away from these conceptions towards what she defines as organizational causality. Now, Haan argues that organizational causality allows us to move away from the idea of levels. So causal relations are neither bottom-up nor top-down, and in fact are more holistic. Instead of levels, she associates organizational causality with the idea of emergence as a form of fusion. She follows here Paul Humphrey's idea of emergence, and he states, when emergence occurs, the lower level property instances go out of existence in producing the higher level emergent instances. And Seneca provides the analogy of a cake, where all of the ingredients, even if they start out as differentiated, once the cake is baked, these ingredients become fused in such a way that one can no longer distinguish sugar from flour or flour from flavorings. So it's a cake, well, literally a cake without layers. Everything is fused within this cake. Now, in some recent correspondence with Seneca Haan, she makes it clear that this may have been an unfortunate metaphor. The point she wants to defend is that we can no longer, and I'm quoting her email here, we can no longer assume that parts or processes still have the same properties once they have become part of a whole. And she, as she puts it in her book, the parts or processes prior to this configuration are thus not the same as the parts or processes after this configuration. Their relational structure carves out different abilities and inabilities than they had before, either in isolation or as part of a different constellation. Well, I tend to agree with what she says here, but I still think that the notion of fusion and Humphrey's notion that the the elements kind of disappear and form new things altogether. That idea of fusion doesn't really capture the right idea. So with the idea of fusion, I think we go from a mishmash of levels in someone like Guerin's to a situation in which not only levels, but all useful distinctions disappear. And in psychiatric practice, one needs a model of integration that does not subvert useful distinctions among the neurobiological, the phenomenological, the social, and the existential. I think in psychiatric practice, you need to keep track of some of these things, and they can't disappear from your analysis. So this still leaves the problem of integration. What we need, I think, is a solution that rejects the idea of levels. I'm on board with that, and I think Haan is correct in moving away from levels and the whole temptation of reductionism. But we need a solution that leaves intact important distinctions among different contributing factors. So somewhere between levels and fusion, there should be a solution. So I think the solution is this notion of enactive integration. And I've been working recently on some of these issues, and across a number of domains, I've argued for a conception of integration understood in terms of a dynamical pattern or gestalt. And this is an approach that gives up the concepts of levels and hierarchy and top-down versus bottom-up distinctions. So we move away from that that kind of thing. And so there's I've been involved in writing some papers on situated cognition, social cognition, performance, and also conceptions of the self and self disorders. And in each of these, I've tried to make a similar kind of argument that we need to get away from the concept of levels and try to understand a different concept of integration. In terms of psychiatric distinctions, for example, between bio, pheno, psycho, and social, and existential, and so forth, there's no reason to think that neural or bodily processes are more basic than psychological or social processes. That notion of one thing being more basic than another is something that comes along with levels. So if we can get rid of the levels talk, we perhaps can see that all of these different types of processes contribute in varying degrees and across different circumstances and different instances to the issue that we need to explain. So one finds in these domains a variety of factors or processes that need to be understood as integrated in a gestalt fashion, I think. So these can include things like bodily processes, bodily existence, pre-reflective experiential aspects, which itself can be thought of in various terms, such as in psychiatry, sometimes the phenomenologists talk about ipseity or the minimal self, but there are also conceptions of the sense of ownership, the sense of agency that might be part of that notion of pre-reflective experiential aspects. Bodily pre-reflective experience, but also affective processes, behavioral and action aspects, the important social and intersubjective factors, the more traditional cognitive and psychological processes that people want to talk about, reflective, or what Haan calls existential capacities, narrative aspects, ecological relations, which we could describe in terms of affordances or in terms of material engagements, and even normative factors that come along with cultural practices, for example. This is a motley collection of different types of things, different kinds of processes, different kinds of factors, and that presents us with a kind of serious integration problem if we're trying to make sense and allow that all of these types of factors might have some impact upon the condition that we're trying to understand. Clearly, a list of factors or processes is not enough. We need to say specifically how bodily factors relate to pre-reflective experience, for example, or to reflective capacities, or to narrative practices, and so forth. And in the psychiatric context, this has been flagged as an issue, specifically as a criticism of my concept of a self pattern. And so, for example, Sannika de Haan and colleagues, but also Marian Costello, have pointed to this issue. Sannika, for example, writes, this is just a list that I've given, a heaping of aspects without an account of how they relate. There are no considerations on their potential ordering, hierarchy, or structure. But in the case of psychiatric disorders, she says, and their treatment, the relevant questions precisely pertain to this structure and to the relation between aspects of the self. Something like the criticism I've just leveled at her in terms of, moving away from the fusion idea. We do need structure. We do need to identify certain structures and how these things come together. I think, however, that criticism ignores what I've said or have been trying to say about understanding the dynamical gestalt relations among these processes. So I agree, a simple list won't do it, but again, on the other extreme, a fusion where all these different aspects disappear, that won't do either. So if the integration problem is not solved in Guerin's narrow conception or in Sass's wide hierarchical level model, and if we have reasons to doubt that de Haan's fusion model will work in this context, I think we should at least explore the idea of a dynamical gestalt or pattern where there are no hierarchical levels, but also there is no fusion. And I think this would be an alternative way of addressing the integration problem. To be clear, the idea of dynamical connections among the various factors and processes of the pattern or gestalt is part of its definition. It's part of what a pattern is, or part of what a gestalt is. And the concept of pattern at stake here is, at least for me, Scott Kelso's notion of dynamical pattern in his 1995 book. The relevant notion of causality here is, I think, nonlinear dynamical causality rather than reciprocal, circular, or even organizational causality, especially if we think of that in terms of fusion. Okay, so the issue, however, is what this means in the context of psychiatry, or more generally in any context. So that's part of what I want to try to get at. And I want to try to get at it by proposing a threefold method for exploring the dynamical integration in enactive patterns. And I start here with a clue from Philip Guerin's. In discussing loss of the sense of agency in some schizophrenic delusions, he references studies of expert performance, where on some views, expert performance involves the absence of a sense of agency, as one is on kind of automatic pilot or in the flow, compared to a strong sense of agency in novice performance, where there is sort of top-down cognitive control involved. And so he says, we are more aware of our agency when learning a musical instrument than when performing a task automatically and successfully. Well, this sounds quite a bit like Hubert Dreyfus's model. Just here, he would seemingly endorse the Dreyfus model, where expert performance and embodied coping is, in some terms, mindless, or, well, definitely Dreyfus means non-representational. He characterizes it as a kind of a mindless being in the flow. So despite that, in what seems to be an endorsement, at least in this context, most of Guerin's analysis, I think, puts him closer to theorists who argue against Dreyfus, that performance involves mindful elements, and theorists who conceive of a top-down process where lower order automatic processes of embodied coping are modulated by higher order reflective, representational, cognitive aspects. This debate between those who would defend Dreyfus and those who would criticize Dreyfus has motivated the development of what is called the meshed architecture model in performance studies. And I want to sort of borrow that model from performance studies and use it in the context of thinking about psychiatric integration. This, however, is just the first part of a threefold method that I want to propose for explaining the notion of dynamical gestalt and solving the integration problem. So this first part of it is what I would refer to as an enhanced meshed architecture. I'm going to short circuit all of the debates in the performance literature where people are talking about dance, musical performance, acting, athletics, and so forth. And I'm simply going to present what I take to be an enactivist model, an enhanced version of the meshed architecture model. So in contrast to Dreyfus's notion that skilled performance is mindless, Christensen, Sutton, and McElwain, in a very excellent paper, I think, in 2016, propose what they call the meshed architecture model, which involves an integration of cognitive and bodily sensory motor processes. So they are definitely working within the framework of levels, cognitive level versus more bottom-up automatic motor processes. And what they're trying to sort out here is how precisely there's a meshing of these higher order processes and these lower order processes. And John Sutton, in his paper before that in 2011, writes this. He says, skill is not a matter of bypassing explicit thought to let habitual actions run entirely on their own, but of building and accessing flexible links between knowing and doing. The forms of thinking and remembering, things like, and this is a list that comes from the literature, things like self-reflective thinking, planning, predicting, deliberation, selective target control, conscious monitoring, a sense of one's rightly configured body, enhanced pre-reflective awareness, or situation awareness. All of these things are conceived of as sort of top-down processes in this model. He's saying these forms of thinking and remembering, which can in some circumstances reach in to animate the subtle kinesthetic mechanisms of skilled performance must themselves be redescribed as active and dynamic. So the mesh that this group wants to talk about is what they consider a broadly hierarchical division of control responsibilities, with cognitive control usually focused on strategic aspects of performance and automatic body schematic processes, more concerned with implementation in the actual performance. So they put automatic bodily processes down here at the bottom, cognition up here, and then they're trying to explain how cognition reaches in to control these processes. Now this, I think, initial meshed architecture is too top-down and overly intellectualized. So I've argued this in several papers. And what I've proposed instead is a more complex, enhanced conception of the meshed architecture. I'm going to be starting with their model. So at first it's going to look very much like a level type analysis, hierarchical type of analysis, but hopefully we'll be able to move away from that. So this more enhanced conception of meshed architecture involves at least three different components or three different aspects. First of all, a concept of intrinsic control. Control on the enhanced model is not entirely top-down, but rather, if we still think of this on the vertical axis, there are important bottom-up processes that are not simply automatic. Secondly, I think there is a very important horizontal axis that integrates all kinds of factors that are ecological, social, and normative in their effect. So we have to somehow or other pull those into the mesh in order to explain how such factors can indeed have an impact on performance. But also, I think affect or affective processes that modulate the dynamics of integration on both vertical and horizontal axes. So if we add these, at least these three types of phenomena, the intrinsic control, the horizontal axis with the ecological, social, normative factors, and the affective processes, I think we get a more complex conception that needs to be, again, integrated or meshed, but I think it's a fuller account that we ultimately get from this. This meshed architecture involves embodied, ecological, extended, enactive processes, coupling relations of brain, body, and environment. And we can think of it as not just having to do with performance, which is its original kind of home in terms of where it gets developed. But as I've indicated, I think it can nicely apply to processes of self-situated cognition, social cognition, and can map all of these processes, I think, can be mapped onto the meshed architecture. So we can try to create a picture or a diagram that helps us to at least know what processes have to be accounted for. I think further explanation, however, requires an account of the, an account of the dynamical relations among all of these elements, so that we start to think of the mesh more as a dynamical gestalt of processes in which vertical and horizontal are clearly just explanatory abstractions. So we want to get rid of the level talk. We want to get rid of the hierarchical type of analysis and think more in terms of a kind of Gestalt set of relations. So on a dynamical Gestalt view, it's not clear why we should think of neuronal processes as on a more basic or lower level than social processes, unless we have already made some reductionist assumptions. Neural and social processes can be contemporaneous across time scales and can involve reciprocal, circular, organizational, without the fusion idea, but primarily I want to think about them in terms of a nonlinear dynamical causality. On this view, I think we can give up notions of levels and hierarchies and use an interventionist analysis of causal relevance. And this would be the second part of this threefold method for trying to get at this notion of enactive integration. So this is an interventionist strategy based on Jim Woodward's notion of interventionist causality, which helps us to show, well, either reciprocal or nonlinear dynamical causality among the various elements of the Gestalt. So the idea is that an intervention, so for example, that could take the form of a traumatic experience, or it could be a kind of therapeutic intervention. An intervention that addresses one factor in the Gestalt may shift things around, perhaps bestowing more weight on other factors. So the Gestalt is dynamical in the sense that anything that has a causal role to play on any one of the aspects or one of the processes may in fact shift around the whole Gestalt in some fashion. And in contrast to Guerin's, this can be more than just a manipulation of an internal mechanism. For example, a drug effect on neuronal processes. It can be a change in, for example, a social factor, or it could be a therapeutic change in cognitive strategy, or bodily practices, or narrative practices, or some combination. In fact, therapists often think of this in terms of some combination of therapies that can ultimately rearrange the entire Gestalt. So we could think of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, addressing cognitive aspects of the Gestalt, or we could think of narrative therapy as intervening at that particular point, or movement, dance therapy as addressing body schematic processes. And the idea is that in addressing any one of these types of processes, we are in some way perhaps reorganizing, perhaps doing something to the Gestalt structure and the dynamical relations that characterize the different relations between these components or elements. Clearly then, using the model of a meshed architecture to map out the important variables and possible causal relevance is only a first step. The second step is to show causal relevance using interventionist strategies in order to explain the actual meshing of the very different types of factors and processes involved: cognitive, affective, bodily, behavioral, ecological, social, cultural, normative. All of these different types of factors can be tested in this way, either experimentally or clinically through therapies. And their dynamical integration or relations can show up as either enabling or constraining, or at least in some respect, dynamically causal. Again, that's not the full story. There's at least one more step to this, and I think we can get an even more specific and detailed account for some factors using dynamical systems models of coordination dynamics. This is Scott Kelso's work and his colleagues. There's a great article by Tognoli and colleagues in 2020. This is the paper, Coordination Dynamics, a foundation for understanding social behavior. But Kelso has long thought that, as he puts it in 1995, dynamics is a language for connecting events from the generic to the mental. Now, Kelso himself, even in his 1995 book, at certain points, seems to want to get away from the hierarchical type level arrangement. But in the end, he tends to keep that. I think, however, that we can definitely use his notion here of coordination dynamics to think about how we can understand the Gestalt relations. Here in this paper, they describe dynamical patterns that specify the flow of coordination processes across brain processes, movements, postures, gestures, interactions, and the other person's behaviors, for example, and the ongoing organization of these various factors and processes within the context of trying to understand social interaction. Specifically, they propose that these coordinations can be mathematically characterized as coupled, self-organizing dynamical systems. In fact, in social interactions, physical processes at different timescales enter into some degree of dynamical coordination. Coordination dynamics identifies general systems of equations that express the lawful regularities explaining the coordination of such social systems, regardless of scale or material substrate. So although we have a motley collection of different kinds of processes that have an impact on the subject's experience or their psychiatric state, this is cast at a level of abstraction that the specific nature of those processes can still be dealt with. So this kind of analysis identifies, as Tognoli and colleagues put it, emergent phenomena where the whole is not only greater than the sum of its parts, but different too. Kelso's analysis, I think, starts with simple oscillatory processes that form coupled ensembles of a limited cycle. For example, rhythmic finger movements. So he has experiments on this. And the challenge, of course, is to work up to the full detail of social interactions and how all of the various factors can be brought into the picture. And Tognoli and colleagues put it this way: we approach this goal by examining dynamic coordination patterns empirically, embedding those observations in mathematical models, and then returning to empirical data to verify newly arisen predictions in a recursive manner. The system of equations is formalized from two sides, one supplying the intrinsic dynamics of the unit or the particular process that is part of the Gestalt, what it does when left alone to itself, if in fact you can get at that. And the other who significant social scientists will recognize, reflecting constraints imposed by relations with other units. I think basically the interventionist strategy is a good fit for this type of dynamical systems approach. By using this kind of threefold method I'm suggesting, we will get a much more detailed analysis. The final section here, yeah, I think I have time to do this. Let me know if I'm going over time, however, but this will probably take 10 minutes or so, if that's okay.
You're fine, you're fine.
Okay, so I want to look at autism spectrum disorder as a test case. Can the concept of a dynamical gestalt open to therapeutic interventions help to sort out some of the complexity involved in ASD, autism? And in fact, Kelso and colleagues suggest that at least in social cognition, the case of autism provides a test bed for an integrative approach. So if we try to follow our threefold method here and start with the meshed architecture, can we diagram, can we somehow or other characterize autism spectrum disorder using this type of approach? And some of you will be quite familiar with some of the traditional approaches to autism. Traditional, I would say, cognitivist approaches that emphasize cognition, right? So theory of mind problems, people like Baron Cohen and a good number of people who think of autism as involving a problem with theory of mind reading, and so forth. So one, if there are such problems, then we at least can sort of put them here on our diagram and ask how can we deal with them. But this also involves certain neuronal processes. So we can think of this in terms of neural processes connected with theory of mind, so theory of mind mechanisms and mirror neurons, if you prefer the simulationist story. And of course, then we get a problem very much like the problem we found in Christensen, Sutton, McElwain. How do these things mesh? What is the relationship between the neural level and the kind of cognitive level what goes wrong specifically? However, that's not the full story, because there's quite a bit of work showing that in autism spectrum disorder, there are a set of problems concerning affectivity. Affect shapes our everyday actions and our ability to interact effectively with others in social contexts. And a number of people, Peter Hobson is a good example, have argued that there's some kind of issue with the affective life of the autistic individual. And more recently, there's been a lot of work showing that sensory motor processes in the autistic spectrum are disrupted. Sensory motor problems can interfere with all kinds of things, such as motor control. They can disrupt patterns in afferent and proprioceptive sensory feedback. Elizabeth Torres and her work with Maria Brinker is quite a good representative of that. But there's been a lot of work on this, showing problems with motor coordination, postural instabilities, atypical gait, motor sequencing, anticipatory postural adjustments, and so forth and so on, expressionless faces sometimes. And a good number of people have really focused on right, something going wrong at this level, in this case, of body schematic processes. But these are things that contribute to, for example, changes in affordance structure, and also can be disruptive for communicative or conversational practices as well within the autism spectrum. And all of that can lead to differences in how others treat persons with autism. Victoria McGeer is very good on this point. So in other words, we can get a very complex picture here of all kinds of factors, and this might not exhaust the realm, all kinds of factors perhaps contributing to autism spectrum disorder. And then the question is, how can we work with this? I think we can ask how then a therapeutic intervention on one process or factor in this gestalt, sometimes I refer to this as self-pattern in the context of talking about the notion of self, but more generally in this kind of gestalt approach, how intervention on one process or factor affects or realigns other processes. So, for example, Tager Fussberg and Anderson studied conversational ability in children with ASD and suggested that impairment in conversational ability is due to deficits in theory of mind development. So this was followed up on by Hadwin and colleagues who tested this hypothesis by training children with autism on tasks that employ theory of mind cognitive abilities to understand mental states, the mental states of others. And theory of mind, of course, focuses on beliefs, but also emotional states. And they were focusing also on instances of pretense, which of course in autism is also problematic. So the idea then is, well, here's an intervention, a kind of therapy, training in theory of mind processes that should affect cognition. And if we could sort out theory of mind here, then that could have an effect on communicative behavior. And that was the idea that they proposed. Hardwin and colleagues compared conversation abilities prior to the theory of mind training, and then afterwards, post-training, using 4 categories pertaining to conversation. The first is simply the idea that the child would give a simple answer to a question, for example, provides a one-word, for example, reply to a question, and then didn't further engage in conversation after that. Another possibility is that the child would give a more developed answer, producing utterances that involve 2 or more sentences. Another phenomenon they saw is echoic or repetitive answers, and then there were some simply non sequiturs, unclear responses. So what they found was that after training on theory of mind tasks, and here I'm quoting them, children did learn to pass cognitive tasks concerning emotional and belief understanding. However, there was no corresponding advance in social communication skills. Specifically, no improvement in the development of conversation and no increase in the use of mental state terms in speech was found. And the majority of children with ASD remained in the simple answer category and did not improve. So that seems to suggest that improving theory of mind processes that doesn't lead to changes in conversational ability, or does it improve social interaction in this respect? So we could ask, what about an intervention that would address motor coordination or body schematic processes? Would early intervention, for example, that improved motor coordination have any effect on social interaction? It turns out, I think the answer is not clear, but there are some interesting hypotheses and people have been working on this. So here's a couple of papers, for example, that look at the effect of dance movement therapy as a kind of intervention for children with autism. And here, Shaun and colleagues state, in dance movement therapy, repetitive actions and motor distortions are accepted and listened to as forms of communication, although unintentional and unconscious. A strategy of mirroring in such therapy resulted in an increase in synchronous movement, communicative gestures, and a decrease in tuning out behaviors and aversion to touch. So they suggest that it has some effect on the communicative processes, conversation and such. A more cautious review has been done by Takahashi and colleagues in 2019, where they suggest, well, the results are somewhat mixed due to perhaps variations, in the spectrum itself, and also variations in the therapeutic programs. So things are not as clear as Shaun and colleagues think. I think, however, here a study by Kosterbrick and colleagues in 2018, and they reference Kelso's coordination dynamics approach. And they compared 20 autism spectrum disorder children to 21 typically developing children ages 8 to 14 years. And they compared them on motor coordination in intentional motor tasks. And then they correlated that to a score on the socio-adaptive quotient, SAQ, scores that measure communication ability and socialization. Some very basic things such as saying please or thanks or excuse me. They showed that there was no noticeable or notable differences between autistic children and typically developing children in simple perceptual motor coordination tasks. But the ASD children showed increasing deficits in more demanding interpersonal coordination tasks when coordination patterns were intentionally requested by the experimenter. And this correlated to poor SAQ scores. And this, it turns out, is consistent with other studies. So they came to this hypothesis. They say, this leaves the hypothetical and to be tested possibilities that by manipulating motor coordination parameters in ASD children, their coordination abnormalities could be reduced and their social deficits perhaps alleviated. Okay, I think maybe it's more complicated than that. So consider that increased deficits in communication behavior sort of turn up here in the experimental setting when socially interacting with the experimenter. Plus, we have the fact that in other disorders, so for example, ADHD, anomalies exist in motor coordination, but they don't lead to social deficits. And if you kind of add these two things together, I think it suggests that there's not a one-way causal relation here, but something maybe more nuanced. I would think a kind of dynamical, nonlinear relation between social interaction, communication behavior, and motor coordination. Accordingly, a more detailed dynamical coordination study may be required to sort out such relations. And there is a study conducted by Fitzpatrick using coupled oscillator modeling, and they showed that adolescents with ASD demonstrate less interactive synchronization in both spontaneous and intentional social coordination, corresponding to lower sensitivity and decreased attention to the other person. So in this experiment, two subjects are coordinating the swinging of handheld pendulums. And this is a methodology that has demonstrated the strength of interpersonal synchronization. So this is what they're trying to measure here, a synchronization between the communication partners, let's say. And so they say, using such a dynamical model to understand how synchrony breaks down in social deficits has the distinct advantage of allowing one to infer which dynamical components of the model are underlying the impairment. So we can think then that the disruption of interactional dynamics, the embodied interpersonal engagement and pragmatics that are involved, rather than disruptions due to theory of mind or specific language deficits, may be more likely the root of the problems with social interaction and conversational ability and things like that. The more general suggestion is that such interventions may help to show nonlinear dynamical causal relevance, not just reciprocal or causality or organizational fusion, but a more dynamical conception of causality. And so I think then one needs to study a complex integration by means of the dynamical relations that exist between bodily processes, social, intersubjective, communicative behavior, affective, cognitive, and so forth and so on, all these other factors that may play a role. I think one can get to understand how these things are related within the Gestalt through this interventionist strategy and then through a kind of detailed dynamical analysis. Okay, so my conclusion, on this dynamical Gestalt view, I think one can first give up explanatory concepts of levels or hierarchy. Second, still use interventionist analysis to identify causal relevance, and specifically nonlinear dynamical causality that allows useful distinctions to be made between various factors and processes, and at the same time can account for their integration. And three, provide a dynamical systems explanation in which there may be recursive or looping processes, but in contrast to Guerin's predictive processing models, as Kelso put it back in 1995, in such systems, in these dynamical systems, there are no reference state. There's no reference state with which feedback can be compared and no place where comparison operations are performed. So that would be a kind of monkey wrench thrown into a predictive processing account, I would think. Although there might be ways to work that out. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much. And I'll try to see if anybody's there. Let me see.
If we're still here, Shaun. Thank
okay.
you very much.
Stop sharing. Okay. Oh yeah, you are.